Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jaylen Waddle, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 11 wide receiver rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season, going over my top 36 wide receivers. So if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, please be sure to travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, gain an edge upon your league mates for the remainder of the season by subscribing to the channel, as I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. And by subscribing today, you'll help me get one step closer to achieving my goal of 100,000 subscribers this season. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's begin by talking about the wide receiver position in regards to receiving statistics allowed from weeks 5 through 10 in order to determine which matchups are the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous going into the given week. Based on receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed in a half PPR scoring format, we find the Steelers, Commanders, 49ers, Buccaneers, Bears, Lions, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the wide receiver position, as all of these teams are giving up over 30 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. So of course, Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, who are automatic starts anyway, are going to have that much of a greater potential for upside coming off of the bye week. The Washington Commanders, with all of the injuries that they have taken place on their secondary, Marshawn Lattimore, of course, Jaylen Waddle, the thumbnail of today's episode, is not there by accident. Either way, I'll go ahead and reference back to these statistics over the course of today's episode, while also identifying some of the more disadvantageous matchups, such as taking on the Broncos, Texans, Chiefs, Bengals, Dolphins, etc. Even though some of these matchups, specifically like the Bengals, even though they do have great cornerback play, where they struggle the most is stopping opposing tight ends and running backs. Therefore, teams expose that on a weekly basis, and that's where they find their abundance of success. Nonetheless, again, before we get into talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, for those of you guys who are looking for my all-encompassing rankings at a top 80 capacity at wide receiver, top 60 running backs, top 32 quarterbacks and tight ends, we're talking about top 120 flex for half and full PPR. Be sure to travel down to the description of the video today and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entirety of the season, not only to provide those all-encompassing rankings when you sign up today using code Andrew, make that first-time deposit minimum of 10, but also make a first-time play minimum of $1 within Real Cash Play. As long as you complete those 3 steps, you'll get those rankings sent from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning. But I'm also trying to provide plays every single day. Monday went perfectly. Yesterday was an absolute disaster, but that's the name of the game. Going into today, I like Jalen Brunson going more than 25.5 points and Jared Allen to complete a double-double. I like that going into tonight. But again, for those of you who sign up today, not only will you get, of course, the free pick of Luka Doncic in terms of this overall play going into tonight, but you'll also be able to get a free $10 via Betr. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to go ahead, sign up today. When you do, you get that free $10, but of course you have to be eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen. Thank you very much for all the support and using code Andrew. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one. Taking on the number one matchup at the position, we have Ja'Marr Chase, who over the course of the last 4 games with Joe Flacco is averaging 19.85 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. And in one of those games back in week 7 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, he had 23 targets, 16 receptions, 161 yards and a touchdown for 30.1 half PPR fantasy points. Throughout that game, of course, he took on Darius Slayton, Porter Jr., Eccles, and Jalen Ramsey in coverage. Jalen Ramsey and him have quite the matchup, in which, of course, he had 4 catches for 34 and a touchdown against him. But as of late, Jalen Ramsey has now moved to the safety position. Therefore, against Slay, Porter, and Eccles, we're still going to find a lot of success from Ja'Marr Chase, considering last time out against this team in one-on-one coverage, he had 8 grabs and 78 yards against those 3 cornerbacks. Again, like I've mentioned before, the Steelers are the number one matchup at the position, allowing over 35 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're talking about both Michael Pittman Jr. and Alec Pierce a couple weeks back, going for each 115 receiving yards. Lad McConkey this most recent week, 107 and a touchdown. Expect for an abundance of success from Ja'Marr Chase. Jaxon Smith-Njigba is our number 2 wide receiver, and in his most recent week still came away with a solid performance of 5 catches, 93 and a touchdown, but it could have been even more damage had this game not been a complete blowout early on. I mean, the Seattle Seahawks were up 35-0 with 8 minutes and 33 seconds remaining in the second quarter, primarily because of the 2 defensive touchdowns they were able to rack in incredibly early. And because of the blowout, it led to less opportunity. But going into this week against the LA Rams, I'm expecting a potential shootout between these 2 teams. Even though both of these defenses have played incredibly well, it currently sits at a 48.5 point total, which leads me to believe that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to be highly implicated for a huge performance, because last time out against the LA Rams in week 9 of the 2024 season without DK Metcalf, which again, this season has no DK Metcalf, against the LA Rams went for 13 targets, 7 grabs, 180 and 2 touchdowns for 33.5 fantasy points. The Rams, even though they are a middle of the pack matchup, have given up their fair share of points to Jennings, 71 and a touchdown, Hunter, 101 and a touchdown, and Kendrick Bourne, 10 for 142. Jaxon Smith should be able to follow in their footsteps. Now, speaking of this matchup against the LA Rams, we have Puka Nacua, who is coming off of back-to-back games of great performances, but in the last 4 healthy games in which he has played, he has scored a touchdown minimum in each of those 4 contests, primarily because Matthew Stafford has thrown 3+ passing touchdowns in 5 of the last 6 games. As long as this offense continues to cook at that capacity, taking on the Seattle Seahawks, who are allowing 26.34 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, primarily because of their elite run-stop defense, forcing teams to go to the air in order to catch up in negative scripts, I would anticipate for Puka Nacua to find himself a lot of success, as we have seen most recently. BTJ, 8 catches, 90 and a touchdown. Egbuka, 7 for 163 and a touchdown. In the last 2 games combined for Marvin Harrison against the Seattle Seahawks this season, the 2 games combined for 9 catches, 99 and 2 touchdowns, 1 touchdown in each of those contests. Nonetheless, this is implicated to be one of the highest scoring games of the week with a 48.5 point total. This is a potential precursor to what the NFC Championship may hold in store for us. We'll have to wait and see what this shootout looks like. Number 4 to close out the S tier is Drake London, who is coming off of 4 of the last 5 games with 100 or more receiving yards. The opportunity share continues to go in his direction and now has an opportunity this week to exact some revenge against a division rival, the Carolina Panthers, who beat them 30-0 last time out. As we all know, the Carolina Panthers run the most zone coverage in the National Football League amongst all defenses. And over the course of this season, Drake London ranks 5 amongst all wide receivers in terms of receptions versus zone coverage. He is a zone assassin, just like Romeo Doubs and, of course, Chris Olave, who both recently in the last 2 weeks have gone off against this defense. Olave, 5 for 104 and a touchdown. I know the cornerback fell. Then we have Doubs, 7 for 91. Shakir, 6 for 88 and a touchdown. Drake London's going to find himself in abundance of overall opportunity and success within the upcoming week, as the Panthers, yes, have played well in their secondary, but Drake London is a completely different animal. Moving on to our number 5, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who in this most recent week, obviously they blew out the Washington Commanders. And because of that, that led to less opportunity. Only 8 targets, 5 grabs, 58 and a touchdown. But we'll take the 14.3 fantasy points where we can get it. But this week against the Philadelphia Eagles, in a game in which it is being played in Philadelphia, and of course, the Detroit Lions are somehow, some way the underdogs in this game. If that reality actually comes to fruition and we're going to be in a negative game script, expect for Amon-Ra St. Brown to be littered with a boatload of targets. This most recent game, of course, was the first game that Dan Campbell took over the play calling for this organization over the course of the last couple seasons. It's the highest play action rate this team has seen all season long, and it's the first time all season in which they have had a positive pass rate over expectation this season. So we're going to be in a position in which, of course, far more play action, far more under center, kind of forcing the Philadelphia Eagles to bite in on that run. There's going to be even more opportunities for Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams to make plays over the top of that defense. Moving on to our number 6, CeeDee Lamb, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, coming off of the bye week. In the 2 games prior to the bye week, had 7 receptions and 74 yards minimum in each of those games. And you may be thinking to yourself, Andrew, for CeeDee Lamb, that's underwhelming, but for any other wide receiver, we would be jumping up and down and celebrating for their overall opportunity share looking like that. But again, he was taking on tough coverage in terms of the Denver Broncos and the Arizona Cardinals. So considering the fact that they're taking on the Raiders this week, the 12th best matchup at the position, allowing over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format, where we have recently seen Rashee Rice, 42 and 2 touchdowns, Parker Washington, 8 grabs for 90 yards. Troy Franklin, 5 for 40 and a touchdown. There have been many wide receivers that have succeeded, and considering they are coming off of a bye, I would anticipate for CeeDee Lamb to go ahead and get back to either scoring his touchdown or his 100 yards, maybe hopefully both this week. Number 7, we have Rashee Rice. In his last 3 games prior to the bye week, 16.6, 21.0, and 19.7 fantasy points. He has been unstoppable since returning to this offense. And of course, this offense has performed at an incredibly high level. And even though last time out against the Buffalo Bills was an underwhelming game for the offense as a whole, I would anticipate taking on the Denver Broncos this week for Rashee Rice to be a primary highlight for this offense, considering this is technically the toughest wide receiver matchup at the position, but their primary nickel cornerback, McMillan, has been targeted the 5th most times amongst all corners at the nickel position. He has allowed the 5th most receptions to opposing slot receiving options and the 7th most receiving yards to opposing slot receivers. Therefore, we should anticipate a lot of opportunity in the direction of Rashee Rice, who should maintain as the number 1 receiving option of this offense and in this upcoming contest. Number 8 is Justin Jefferson. It's evident that J.J. McCarthy is responsible for airmailing many of the overall opportunities that should have led to receiving yards in the form of this most recent game against the Baltimore Ravens. Justin Jefferson's wide open on the sideline. It's 10 yards over his head out of bounds. There are many of opportunities in which, of course, J.J. McCarthy would like back. There was another opportunity deep down the field in one-on-one coverage against Marlon Humphreys in which, of course, Justin Jefferson steps on Humphreys' foot, trips, falls, interception. There was 214 total air yards available to Justin Jefferson this most recent game. He only came away with 37 receiving yards. But luckily this week they take on the Bears, in which earlier this season the combination of both Justin Jefferson and J.J. McCarthy were able to find success in that fourth quarter. And this is a matchup that, again, is allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers since week 5, 31.94. We've recently seen wide receivers like T. Higgins, 121 and 2 touchdowns, Chase for 111 yards, Olave, 98 and 2 touchdowns. Many wide receivers succeeding. Justin Jefferson should be next on that list. Number 9, we have Emeka Egbuka, who, even if you're worried about the matchup against the Buffalo Bills, I don't think you should be, especially when we take into account the most recent production from wide receivers against this secondary. We're talking about Drake London, 158 and a touchdown, Tetairoa McMillan, 7 for 99, Rashee Rice, 4 for 80, and of course, Waddle this most recent week in a blowout in their favor in which he didn't need to be utilized much in the second half, 84 yards and a receiving touchdown. The target opportunity continues to maintain at an elite level as he is coming off of 12, 9, and this most recent week 13 total targets. And despite the fact that he has had a bye week in between weeks 7 through 10, throughout that span of time, he's still number 8 amongst all wide receivers in terms of total targets throughout that spectrum. Expect for elite opportunity and elite production once again for Emeka Egbuka in a hopeful shootout against the Buffalo Bills. Number 10, we have Davante Adams. Now, he did tweak his oblique in this most recent game, and I'm hoping that he is going to be at 100% capacity taking on the Seattle Seahawks. If, in fact, he is not available, of course, Puka Nacua's overall opportunity share would effectively increase, as we have seen Davante Adams in the last 2 games. 5 catches, 60 and 2 touchdowns for 20.5 fantasy points. 6 catches, 77 and a touchdown for 16.7 fantasy points and a half PPR. His status is to be determined, but as long as he's available, like I mentioned before with Puka Nacua, the fact of the matter is this is a game that is expected to be a 48.5 point total despite how great these defenses have played because the offenses are elite. And considering the elite run-stopping nature of the Seattle Seahawks defense, expect for a lot of opportunities through the air and especially down in the red zone for Davante Adams to continue to score touchdowns as he has had all season long. Our number 11 is the thumbnail of today's episode, Jaylen Waddle, who in the last 5 non-weather implicated games is averaging 15.86 fantasy points per game. I emphasize that because, again, that game against the Cleveland Browns really didn't do him any service. Nonetheless, this week they take on the Washington Commanders, the second best matchup at the position. With Marshawn Lattimore's season-ending injury, it has opened up an absolute landslide of fantasy points in the direction of wide receivers lately. Rashee Rice, 9 for 93 and a touchdown. Horton, 2 touchdowns, while JSN went for 129. Amon-Ra, 58 and a touchdown, while Jameson Williams went for 119 and a touchdown. The expectation is that Jaylen Waddle should have one of his best games of the season this upcoming week in Madrid early Sunday morning. I'll see you there for the 6 a.m. live stream. Number 12 is Ladd McConkey. Gadsden is potentially expected to practice today. As to whether or not he is going to be available for this upcoming Sunday with the quad/knee injury, we're going to have to wait and see. But what I do know is that the primary nickel cornerback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Jordan Lewis, missed this most recent game. And in the event in which he is hobbled and or potentially going to miss, it opens up even more opportunity for Ladd McConkey, who is continuing to lead this team within the receiving category over the course of the last 6 games, in which they're taking on the number 8 matchup at the position. 29.1 fantasy points per game allowed. Collins went for 136, Adams 35 and 3 tutties, JSN 162 and a touchdown. Ladd McConkey hopefully up for another big game here for our teams. Number 13, speaking of Nico Collins going for 136 yards against the Jaguars, who Ladd McConkey will be taking on this week. Again, with Davis Mills at quarterback, 15 targets, 7 receptions, 136. This is 3 consecutive games of 10 or more targets, which is incredibly promising. And with the return of CJ Stroud taking on the Tennessee Titans, my hope is that that streak is going to continue. But earlier this season, Week 4 against Tennessee, there was a blowout. And because of that, Nico Collins only had 6 targets, 4 catches, 79 yards for 9.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. So I'm truly hoping that there's going to be even more opportunity in his direction and that the Tennessee Titans can keep this close, even though they are giving up over 26 and a half fantasy points per game to opposing receivers, recently giving up, Quentin Johnston a touchdown, Michael Pittman Jr. 95 and a touchdown, Kayshon Boutte 55 and a touchdown, and Marvin Harrison Jr. 98 yards. Collins should be implicated for a fantastic week. We're just hoping that the blowout doesn't phase him out of the overall opportunity share. Number 14 is T. Higgins. Last time out against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who he has the privilege of taking on this week, he had 10 targets, 6 grabs, 96 and a touchdown for 18.6 fantasy points. In the last 3 games with Joe Flacco, averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game, as they have continued to build their rapport lately. They have the number 1 matchup this week taking on the Steelers, allowing over 35 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, while this defense is trying to, of course, slow down Jamar Chase on the opposite side of the field. It's only going to open up more opportunity for T. Higgins, who is coming off of a week of over 120 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns with Joe Flacco last time out. Therefore, we're hoping for him to put together a very similar performance, as 3 wide receivers in just the last 2 weeks have gone for over 100 yards against this Pittsburgh secondary. Number 15 is Davante Smith, who effectively has become the number 1 receiving option of this offense over the course of weeks 3 and beyond. Throughout that span of time, has been number 11 overall ranked wide receiver in fantasy and number 9 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, averaging nearly 14.5 PPR scoring format throughout that spectrum of time. And I understand there's been time in those games in which A.J. Brown has missed due to injury, but even in that game, he didn't go off. Ultimately, with A.J. Brown on the field, it only opens up more opportunity for success for Davante Smith. In this most recent game on Monday night, the safety coverage over the top of the side of A.J. Brown was consistent all game long. And because of that, it opened up even more opportunity in one-on-one coverage for Davante Smith to find a seam down the field and score over the top of that Green Bay secondary. Nonetheless, going into this week, they take on the Lions, the 6th best matchup at the position, a defense and a secondary that has dealt with many of injuries in regards to that safety and cornerback position lately. I mean, again, this defense is allowing over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They've allowed, of course, Hollywood Brown with 2 touchdowns, Tez Johnson with a touchdown, JJ with a touchdown, Deebo with a touchdown. We're hoping for Davante Smith, A.J. Brown to be able to follow suit in an overall potential shootout this week. Number 16 is Romeo Doubs. This most recent week, I lessened his overall ranking going into Sunday, primarily because I thought the weather was going to be an implication in which this game may go to the ground game. And because of the negative game script, with the New York Giants taking an incredibly early lead, it led to, of course, Caleb Williams airing it out, which led to 10 targets in the direction of Odunze for 6 catches, 86 and a touchdown, a wide open touchdown at that within the red zone after a week in which he had 0 fantasy points. We'll take it. Again, this week they take on the Minnesota Vikings. They are the 9th best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 28 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra, 9 for 97. Jamo, 4 for 66 and a touchdown. Ladd, 6 for 88 and a touchdown. Smitty going for 183 and a touchdown. Again, back in week 1, Romeo Doubs played well against the secondary. 9 targets, 6 grabs, 36 and a touchdown. We're hoping for very similar opportunity share within the week with even more yardage upside within the matchup. Number 17, we have George Pickens. Look, this season without CeeDee Lamb in the lineup, he was averaging 23 plus fantasy points per game. While since we've had CeeDee Lamb back in the lineup, over the course of the last 3 games, only averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game. But we're talking about 3 consecutive games of 10.2 or more fantasy points without a single touchdown scored. So the potential of him scoring a touchdown and getting to that 16 to 18 point range is very much so potentially possible, which would absolutely elevate him into the top 15 wide receiver conversation under the assumption he scores this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, who are the 12th best matchup at the position, allowing over 27 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. As long as CeeDee Lamb is on the opposite side of the field pulling number 1 coverage, expect for George Pickens on the opposite side to be able to find himself in abundance of overall opportunity in a game which is expected to be the highest scoring of the week, primarily because they anticipate the Dallas Cowboys coming off of the bye to light up this Raiders secondary. Moving on to our number 18, we have Stefon Diggs. Speaking of consistency as late, very similar to George Pickens, this is a wide receiver who has scored 10 plus fantasy points consistently. I mean, I'm talking about since week 4. He's been able to average 11.5 fantasy points per game, which makes him the number 15 overall wide receiver and number 21 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, and now has an opportunity of taking on the New York Jets. They are currently 12.5 point favorites going into the Thursday night game, and because of the injuries that have taken place within this offense, to the form of Ramondre Stevenson and Kayshon Boutte lately, Stefon Diggs has evidently become the favorite red zone option within this offense for Drake May. In the last 2 weeks, the New York Jets without Sauce Gardner have given up 91 on 12 receptions to Jamar Chase, and of course, 78 and a touchdown to Jerry Jeudy. In the absence of cornerback, competency, and additionally, the absence of Michael Carter II, their nickel cornerback, it opens up even more opportunity for Stefon Diggs to be an automatic play this week. Number 19 is Jauan Jennings. He's coming off of 4 consecutive games of 4+ receptions and back-to-back games of a touchdown. The reason why I currently have him as high as number 19 is because of a couple speculations that I have. First and foremost, Will Johnson and Max Melton, both of the starting cornerbacks of the Arizona Cardinals, missed this most recent game. In the event in which they're going to miss another consecutive game, of course, Jauan Jennings is an automatic play in this circumstance. But I'm also expecting for Mac Jones to be the starting quarterback this week, as Purdy and Pearsall and their current status is to be determined. Sure, they could both end up returning this week, but I would anticipate that Jauan Jennings with Mac Jones is the most likely outcome out of this week. Therefore, I would be very much so excited about the potential of starting him against the secondary that is dealing with many of injuries. And if in fact Johnson and Melton are going to miss another consecutive game, I would anticipate for Jauan Jennings to continue his streak of not only a high volume of upside, but of course, hopefully finding the end zone. Number 20 is A.J. Brown. Look, 3 targets for A.J. Brown this most recent game should be illegal. I mean, genuinely, the offensive coordinator needs to be changed. We need to get one of the most elite wide receivers in fantasy football and in the NFL the ball on a far more consistent basis. And taking on the Lions this week is a perfect opportunity to do so. Because, again, this is the 6th best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and have given up touchdowns to guys like Hollywood Brown, Tez Johnson, and Deebo Samuel as of late. So why not A.J. Brown? If the opportunity presents itself in a game which should be, in my opinion, a shootout between these two teams, I'm hoping for, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles offense to go to the air and look in the direction of A.J. Brown far more often than they have lately. Number 21 is Jameson Williams. Within this same contest, like I just mentioned moments ago, I'm hoping for a shootout. And considering the overall opportunity share that Jameson Williams has had in back-to-back games with a greater opportunity looks leading to touchdowns, I'm hoping for that to only continue, considering Dan Campbell just most recently in this game took over play calling duties. I mean, this is the most that we have seen Jameson Williams utilized as of late. Again, they're going to continue to send the ball in his direction, considering how highly Dan Campbell speaks on Jameson Williams and his contributions to this team. My only concern is Quinyon Mitchell and the matchup against that cornerback. If in fact that ends up being a problem, we could end up seeing less potential for upside in this circumstance. Number 22 is Quentin Johnston taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Look, Quentin Johnston had a promising opportunity share this most recent week, and even though earlier this season there was a lot of concern regarding should we be dropping Quentin Johnston, I was asked that on multiple occasions over the course of the last couple of weeks of live streams and, of course, conversations. But we've, of course, stand true with the idea that he was going to bounce back, and he effectively has as of late. Now, in this most recent game, didn't come away with the greatest overall fantasy point contribution, but with Gadsden's injury obviously playing an impact, I think going into this week's matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 8th best wide receiver matchup, you know, a team that has given up 136 to Collins, 162 to JSN, 35 and 3 tutties to Adams. I think this could very easily be a week in which either Quentin Johnston goes for a high yard total or finds himself wide open in the end zone, considering the struggles that the Jacksonville Jaguars have had in their secondary. Number 23 is Wan'Dale Robinson. Look, in weeks 1 and 2, without Jackson Dart, with Russell Wilson as a starting quarterback, had 8 targets, 6 catches, 55 in game 1. And in game 2, 10 targets, 8 catches, 142 and a touchdown. A lot of opportunity going in his direction, which has continued to stay consistent over the course of the last couple weeks. In 4 of the last 5 games, 6 or more receptions. In a PPR, an absolute demon. But when we're talking about the potential this upcoming week, Jameis Winston is expected to be the starting quarterback. This is going to be a shootout. We saw Jameis Winston last season elevate not only the value of Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, David Njoku, but also Elijah Moore. Every single receiving threat for the Cleveland Browns from weeks 8 through 15 last season had a huge jump in fantasy point contributions because of purely Jameis Winston. Therefore, Wan'Dale Robinson, get ready for him to ball out against Green Bay this week. Number 24 is Tez Johnson. Like I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are worried about the potential of Emeka Egbuka, I think you shouldn't be, considering, again, this secondary and, of course, the run-stopping efforts of the Buffalo Bills have made them out to be one of the lesser defenses that we need to be worried about. I mean, we're talking about a secondary that, of course, gave up 158 and a touchdown to London, 99 to Tetairoa McMillan, 80 to Rice, and 84 and a touchdown to Waddle. While Emeka Egbuka is going to be on the opposite side of the field pulling double coverage and number 1 cornerback coverage at that, of course, Tez Johnson has benefited over the course of the last 4 games, having scored a touchdown in 3 of those games. And this most recent week, coming away with 2 tutties. I understand one was with 30 seconds left in the game. Garbage time or not, it doesn't matter. That's fantasy points in our pocket. Coming off of the last 3 games of 20 total targets. The opportunity share is going to be there. And if it's going to be a negative game script, expect for a lot of opportunity for Tez Johnson in garbage time. Parker Washington's our number 25. Speaking of garbage time, we're hoping that's going to be a very much so beneficial time for Parker Washington to find success, especially with Travis Hunter's season-ending injury elevating his value and Brian Thomas Jr. still dealing with that high ankle sprain. This should lead to Parker Washington continuing to see a lot of opportunity, as he has had in the last 3 games 26 total targets, back-to-back weeks with 13 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And considering he's the number 1 receiving option against the Los Angeles secondary that has played incredibly well, I mean, again, it's going to be Parker Washington versus their primary zone coverage. If, in fact, he continues to be the primary kind of security blanket of Trevor Lawrence this week, expect for a lot of upside for him this week. Number 26, speaking of being a security blanket, that's exactly what Troy Franklin is for Bo Nix, coming off of the last 4 games of 37 total targets. It is a ridiculous opportunity share on top of the fact that he has scored a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. As long as this continues to be the case, he's an auto start. The fact of the matter is he's continuing to outproduce Courtland Sutton on a weekly basis over the course of the last month of the season, and because of this, of course, Trey Franklin has value. My only concern, and the only reason he sits at number 26, is the coverage of Trent McDuffie, who is one of the better nickel cornerbacks in the National Football League as of late. Moving on to our number 27, it is Zay Flowers. Look, Zay Flowers has existed around the number 27 range of wide receiver for quite some time now. This season in a half PPR scoring format, since week 4, we have seen Zay Flowers average the number 33 weekly ranking spot, in comparison to in a full PPR averaging around, kind of wide receiver 30 overall. As of late, again, hasn't been given the greatest overall opportunity, especially considering we know he's not going to often score touchdowns, but 5 catches for 64 and 4 catches for 75 in the last 2 weeks will take it. Taking on Cleveland this week, especially with the possibility of Rashad Bateman being injured, there could be even more upside considering last time out against Cleveland, 7 catches for 75, primarily because the run game of Derrick Henry was completely removed from the equation. If Rashad Bateman is out, the run game disappears, and there's a possibility for Zay Flowers to step up to the task on hand. I'd expect for a lot of potential for upside considering many of wide receivers have exposed this defense as of late, whether it's Hollins, Booty, or Metcalf. Moving on to our number 28, we have Romeo Doubs. Look, since week 8, he is ranked as the wide receiver 33, 27, 38, and 22 overall. And again, this most recent week, I'm not even mentioning it because he came away with 1 grab and 5 receiving yards and 1 fantasy point. So the hope is that going into this week, he's not going to see Quinyon Mitchell once again, but in fact is going to be taking on a secondary that has had many of injuries and of course have given up the fair share of yards to opposing wide receivers. This New York Giants secondary plays a lot of man coverage, and they've been exposed all season long. And I'm hoping for Romeo Doubs to follow into the footsteps of Odunze, Jennings, Smith, Sutton, who have all gone for a fair share of yardage count, if not a touchdown. Okay, we're talking about Odunze, Smith, and Sutton, the number 1 wide receivers of those offenses, all going for over 84 yards in each of those games. While Jennings and Odunze in the last 2 weeks have gone for touchdowns, that's the hope for Romeo Doubs this week in a bounce-back performance. Number 29 is Darius Slayton. I understand that he popped up on the injury report earlier today with a hamstring, and we're hoping that, of course, he's going to be ready for this weekend's game against Green Bay because Jameis Winston is starting at quarterback. And that is implicating a lot of potential for upside considering Winston in 2024 from weeks 8 through 15 elevated Jerry Jeudy, the number 1 receiving option in the Cleveland Browns offense, to averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game and a half PPR throughout that spectrum of time, weeks 8 through 15. As long as Darius Slayton is active, healthy, and ready to go against Green Bay, expect for a plethora of targets and a lot of garbage time receiving workload in his direction for fantasy purposes. Number 30 is Khalil Shakir. Look, he's coming off of 4 of the last 5 games with 6 or more receptions. That is pretty much of the same caliber of a Wan'Dale Robinson. They are both PPR merchants, and as long as that's going to continue to be the case, and they take on the 4th best matchup at the wide receiver position, the Buccaneers allowing 33.44 fantasy points per game, who have recently given up Amon-Ra St. Brown 6 catches, 86 and a touchdown. Olave 8 for 63. Shaheed 9 for 75. Diggs 5 for 46 and a touchdown. Hollins 6 for 106. And the Dalton Kincaid hamstring injury leads to even more potential opportunity as the number 1 receiving option. I think the number 30 spot could be him being underranked in comparison, but he has to score a touchdown. Because in a half PPR, 7 receptions or 6+ receptions in 4 of the last 5 games isn't as impactful as the touchdown and yardage he would theoretically gather. Moving on to our number 31, we have Courtland Sutton. Look, to begin the season, he had 13 plus fantasy points and a half PPR in 5 of his first 7 games. And that was pretty much a continuation to the back end of the 2024 campaign with Bo Nix. But over the course of the last 3 games, he has had less than 10 fantasy points back to back to back. And because of this unfortunate potential reality, we have shifted away from Courtland Sutton as we have to be incredibly careful taking on one of the tougher matchups at the wide receiver position, even though we are anticipating Kansas City to potentially put up a huge point total and force Bo Nix to throw the ball. He just hasn't been the greatest quarterback of the last couple weeks. And the tides could shift in any given moment. It just takes one singular pass down the field for a touchdown for Courtland Sutton to be relevant once again. But in terms of the overall prioritization, in terms of target opportunity for Courtland Sutton, it's been far behind what Troy Franklin's been exposed to as of late, which just isn't right. Moving on to number 32 is Jordan Addison. Look, if it wasn't for the 2 tipped passes that were sent in terms of targets in his direction, he would have came away with 50 more receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. He would have came away with 5 grabs, 85 and a touchdown this most recent week. So I'm sure there's a multiverse out there in which those 2 passes weren't tipped, and he comes away with being a top 15 wide receiver this most recent week, and I rank him higher this week. Taking on the Bears, the 5th best matchup at the position, coming off of a week of 11 targets, the assumption is that he should have himself a far better performance, but the reality of the situation is, besides those tipped passes, there's still a lot of inaccurate passes in the direction of Addison and Jefferson. The quarterback play isn't at its best. So due to my lack of trust for JJ McCarthy, I just wanted to be a little bit more conservative on my ranking for Jordan Addison, even though I do believe he could very easily be an E-tier wide receiver this week in that top 24 conversation, just purely off of what the potential was this most recent game. Then we move on to number 33, Deebo Samuel, who has become 100% dependent of touchdowns with Marcus Mariota under center. He either scores 2 to 3 fantasy points or scores double-digit points because he scored a touchdown with Mariota. And taking on the Miami Dolphins this week, we would assume a negative game script. And if in fact that is going to be explored, of course, Deebo Samuel should be started. But you would assume that in the absence of Terry McLaurin and Luke McCaffrey and Chris Moore doing nothing, you would assume that you would get more than 5 or 6 targets in the direction of Deebo Samuel. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. Number 34 is DK Metcalf. Look, the fact of the matter is DJ Turner and the matchup itself has been disastrous for wide receivers this season. Specifically back in week 7 against Cincinnati, 5 targets, 3 catches, 50 yards, and 6.5 fantasy points. The Bengals are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And considering how horrible they have been against running backs and tight ends, where the Steelers' offense is pretty much built around getting the ball to their tight ends and running backs, expect for DK Metcalf to potentially take a back seat this week if it isn't for a goal line potential fade for a touchdown in this upcoming contest. Number 35 is Tetairoa McMillan. Look, back in week 3 against Atlanta, in a game in which they won 30-0, he only had 3 grabs for 48 yards on 8 targets. Again, the Atlanta Falcons, the way to take advantage of their secondary is not to take on AJ Terrell, which we're going to see a lot of this week. It's deep passes down the field, in which Waddle has had a 43-yard touchdown, Demario Douglas went for 57 yards, and Alec Pierce had a 37-yard touchdown. Unfortunately, Tetairoa, amongst all wide receivers this season, again, hasn't been utilized 20 or more yards down the field very often. Only has 4 receptions of 20 or more yards. So therefore, Tetairoa McMillan, not the greatest overall play this week, and once again, a low-end wide receiver 3. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention before we close out today's episode is Keenan Allen. The fact of the matter is, Gadsden's injury could increase his overall usage, but it is a top 8 wide receiver matchup. His overall opportunity share has not been vital, and if in fact Gadsden is playing, I would probably tell you to not play Keenan Allen this week, as he has certainly taken the number 4 wide receiver role of this offense as they have begun to highlight other opportunities for Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, and Gadsden as we go forward. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 36 wide receivers. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be live streaming later today, starting at 6 p.m. PST, maybe 6:15. We'll have to wait and see. But until then, thank you, everybody. I'll see you guys tomorrow for tight end and quarterback rankings. But until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.